The building smelled like someone had been waiting. Reed Callahan noticed it the moment the door swung inward. Not the smell of rot or abandonment, though those things were present underneath, layered beneath everything else like sediment beneath river water. What he noticed first was the smell of a working place. Oil and metal and old leather and something else. Something that took him a moment to locate in memory. Faint and almost imagined. The ghost of coffee that had been brewed so many times in a space that the walls themselves had absorbed it. He stood in the doorway and did not go in. He had learned, in the years when the cost of moving too fast was paid in ways that couldn't be recovered, to stand outside a situation before entering it. To let his eyes adjust and his other senses do their work first. He had learned this late and at considerable expense. But he had learned it. What he saw, resolving slowly out of the dimness, stopped him in a way he had not expected to be stopped by anything in a very long time. He was 44 years old. He had $137 in a checking account that charged him $8 a month to exist. He had a 2003 Sportster parked outside an apartment he shared with rotating strangers because the rent was $400 and the alternative was the street. He had a mechanic's certification he hadn't used at a legitimate shop in 6 years. A disciplinary citation from a chapter that had effectively ended 11 years of membership, and the particular kind of posture that develops in men who have spent too long apologizing for taking up space. He had been a Hell's Angel. He had been former for 3 years. The exit had not been dramatic. That was the thing about it that had taken the longest to process. Not that it happened, but that it happened quietly. There had been a situation. There had been a brother in trouble. The kind of trouble that had a specific trajectory if nothing intervened. And Reed had intervened in the only way available to him, which was to make a call he was not supposed to make and disrupt a transaction the chapter had a material interest in. He had done it because the alternative was watching someone he'd ridden with for 8 years go down a road he couldn't come back from. He had calculated, and the calculation had been wrong or right, depending on what you were calculating for. Nobody had put hands on him. Nobody had needed to. There was a meeting. There was a decision. And then he was standing in a parking lot in Albuquerque with his tank bag and his certification and the particular lightness of a man who has had most of the things constituting his identity removed at once. He drifted north. Pueblo because someone knew someone. The someone he knew turned out to be unreliable. The someone they knew had moved to Denver. And Pueblo turned out to be a working city that didn't ask questions and didn't offer answers, which suited the condition Reed was in just fine. He was not in crisis. He understood that. Crisis requires a person to believe the current moment is exceptional, that things could be different, that something could change. Reed had moved past crisis into a territory with no name, where you wake up and do the necessary things and lie back down and wait for the days to accumulate into something that eventually makes sense. He wasn't waiting for sense anymore either. He was just waiting. So when he heard the auctioneer announce a starting bid of $19, and the small crowd in that crack parking lot on Thatcher Avenue made the sounds people make when they've heard a joke, Reed Callahan did not laugh. He looked at the building the way a mechanic looks at an engine someone else has given up on. Not with hope, with habit. He raised his hand, not dramatically, not with any feeling behind it he could name. The way a man raises his hand in a meeting he didn't know he'd walked into. The auctioneer, a thin man in a county surplus jacket reading from a property sheet with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a grocery list, looked at Reed, looked at him again. Nobody else moved. $19, going once. The heavy-set man in the Carhartt jacket standing near Reed turned around with the genuine puzzlement of someone whose morning had just produced something he couldn't categorize. "You know there's a title dispute on that property," he said. "Not unkindly, you could win the auction and never own the thing." Reed said he knew. "Going twice." "What are you going to do with it?" "Don't know yet." "Sold." Reed walked to the folding table and wrote a check for $19. The auctioneer accepted it with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to editorialize about other people's decisions. He explained that the property transferred with all existing encumbrances, that there was a potential challenge to auction validity, that paperwork would be processed by end of week. Reed received a single key on a county ring. Old schlag, worn at the grip, a plastic tag reading Unit 4471 Thatcher Avenue in faded marker. and put it in his jacket pocket. He walked to the door. Behind him, he heard the heavy-set man say to no one in particular that he didn't know whether to feel sorry for the man or buy him a beer. The lock didn't want to turn. That was the first thing the building told him. The cylinder had corroded enough that the key went in smoothly and then met resistance that wasn't mechanical, so much as it was accumulation. Years of disuse and humidity and the stubbornness of metal that has been asked to hold something in place for longer than metal usually agrees to hold things. Reed stood on the front step and did not force it. He put his left hand flat against the doorframe and let the resistance in his right hand tell him what it needed. A quarter turn back, a quarter turn forward, feeling for the place where the cylinder wanted to go rather than where he wanted to push it. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The lock turned, the door swung inward. The smell came first, not rot. There was some of that underneath, the inevitable biology of a sealed space. But what reached him before anything else was the mineral smell of gear oil and the bite of old tool metal, and beneath both of those, very faint, almost imagine, the ghost of coffee. Brewed so many mornings in this place that the walls had absorbed it the way old wood absorbs everything that happens in its presence. He stood in the doorway, let his eyes adjust, let his senses do their work. What he saw stopped him. The bikes were still there. 3 of them. 2 on the floor, 1 on a center stand, all Harleys, all old enough to be interesting and recent enough to be familiar. Dust covered them in the uniform gray layer that time applies to everything it decides to hold on to. But they were intact. No vandalism, no stripping, no evidence that anyone had been inside since the day the door was locked. The service counter ran along the left wall, glass-top display cases underneath. Empty now, but with felt pads still in the places where merchandise had rested. Behind the counter, a pegboard still held tools. Not all of them, but enough. Wrenches, sockets, 2 snap-on ratchets that looked even from across the room like they'd been hung with care, a torque wrench on its own peg. And on the counter itself, a coffee cup, white ceramic with a black handle, just sitting there like someone had set it down to answer a question and never came back for it. On the wall above the counter, a calendar, paper yellowed and curled at the corners. Reed had to look closely at the year printed at the top. He looked at it twice. 12 years. The building had been sealed for 12 years. He found the breaker box on the back wall of the service bay and opened it without much expectation. The power was still live. He tripped the main breaker and fluorescents came on, 1 flickering, 2 out entirely, but 4 of them working, and the bay filled with the flat brightness of a functioning shop. The hydraulic lift was in the down position. The floor jack was in the corner where floor jacks live in shops run by people who believe that a tool should always be where you left it. The diagnostic equipment was dated but present. The oil drain pans were stacked on the correct shelf. Whoever had locked this place had not done it in a hurry. They had done it the way you seal something you intend to come back to, or the way you seal something you intend someone else to find, with the care that distinguishes an ending from a pause. Reed stood in the center of the service bay and turned a slow circle. He was not a sentimental man. He had trained that out of himself early, or it had been trained out by circumstance, or he had simply lived long enough in conditions that don't reward sentiment to have filed that impulse somewhere he couldn't easily reach. But standing in this bay with the smell of old oil and the light of old fluorescence and the 3 covered bikes waiting like they'd been parked for a long weekend, something moved in his chest that he could not name and was not going to try to name. He went back to the front, stood behind the counter, put both hands flat on the glass. That was when he saw it. Not immediately, the kind of thing you see only because the light hits at the right angle at the right moment, revealing an edge you wouldn't otherwise notice. Under the counter, not in the display cases but behind them, pressed against the back wall, a steel box, military green, combination lock, small enough to carry with 2 hands, heavy enough, from the look of it, to matter. He crouched down, put his hands on it, lifted, heavy. Whatever was inside, there was enough of it to carry weight. He set it on the counter. He checked the combination lock out of habit, running through a few common sequences, not surprised when none of them worked. He examined the box the way he examined unfamiliar mechanical assemblies, gauge of steel, quality of hinges, the construction of the lock mechanism, government surplus or close to it. Someone had not put cheap things inside a cheap container. He was aware, standing there, that he had purchased this building 40 minutes ago. He had purchased it because he raised his hand. He had raised his hand because he was walking past at a specific moment and the price was $19. And something in him, some mechanism that operated entirely outside the reach of reason, had moved his arm before his brain could complete a single calculation. He had $19 left in his checking account, not counting the $8 monthly fee he couldn't remember if he'd paid. He was standing in a building he technically might not own, in a city he had arrived in by accident, looking at a locked steel box that someone had left under a counter beside a coffee cup they'd never come back to drink. His phone buzzed. The tire shop. He was supposed to be there in 20 minutes. Reed looked at the box. He set it back under the counter exactly where he'd found it. He photographed the service bay. He photographed the calendar. He photographed the coffee cup. He locked the front door and stood on the step in the afternoon light and called the shop. "It's Reed," he said. "I'm not going to make it in." He listened. "I know, I'll make it right." He hung up. He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned back to the building. He needed light, not the fluorescence. Full light, daylight, or as close as he could get, so he could see the front space properly. The window boards were screwed in from the inside, which meant he could remove them, which meant he needed a drill or a screwdriver. He had neither at the building. He walked to the hardware store on the corner, bought a cordless driver, a set of bits, a dust mask, and work gloves with cash from his wallet. He ran the arithmetic automatically, the way people who live close to the margin always run it, precise and without the softening that people apply to numbers they don't want to face. $41. He had $61 in his wallet now and $118 in the checking account. He went back to the building. He started pulling boards. The first board came off the north front window and the afternoon light entered at the angle of someone arriving late but arriving, and what it showed him made him stop. There was a fourth bike, partially hidden behind a half-wall divider he hadn't noticed in the dimmer light. Older than the others, different in a way that registered before he fully understood what he was seeing. He crossed the floor and crouched beside it. A knucklehead. The engine architecture that had given the model its name, rocker covers shaped like clenched fists from a certain angle, marked it immediately. The model ran from the late 30s through the early 50s. He wasn't an antique specialist. His training was in late model service and repair, the mechanical work of the past 25 years. But he had been around bikes long enough, and around people who loved bikes long enough, to know what he was looking at. And more than that, he knew what he was seeing in the condition of it. This machine had been maintained. Not recently, nothing in this building was recent, but maintained in the sense that someone had applied consistent care over time. The kind of care that prevents the serious deterioration that makes restoration impossible rather than merely difficult. The chrome had oxidized but hadn't pitted. The leather was cracked but hadn't decayed to brittleness. The engine case was dirty with age, but when he put his palm flat against it and looked at what came away on his skin, the grime was surface. Not deep. Whoever had locked this building had not abandoned this machine. They had preserved it. Reed put his hand back on the tank, left it there. "What did you do for a living?" he said quietly to the room. The building held the question without answering it. He went back to pulling boards. By 4 in the afternoon, all 4 front windows were uncovered, and the daylight reached into corners the fluorescence hadn't, picking up the colors the dust suppressed but couldn't eliminate. The old orange of the Harley signage above the parts counter, the deep walnut of the counter itself, the pale green of a vintage tool chest someone had painted over with enamel and never repainted when fashion changed. He searched the building records on his phone. The county database was slow, but the information was there. The building had last been registered to Hayes Moto LLC. The principal on the filing was listed as one Walter C. Decker. He searched the name. Not much came up. A Facebook profile not updated in over a decade. A brief newspaper item in the Pueblo Chieftain. 2 paragraphs about a local business receiving a community service commendation from the city, accompanied by a small photograph of a man shaking hands with a city official. Reed enlarged the photograph as far as the resolution would allow. The man was older, probably mid-60s when the photo was taken, heavy in the shoulders, white hair cut close. He was not smiling, not performing the ease that people perform for cameras. He was looking directly at whoever had taken the picture with the composed, specific attention of someone accustomed to watching things and drawing conclusions from what he saw. Reed set the phone down. He looked at the steel box. The combination was not going to reveal itself by looking at it, which meant he either found it in the building or he cut the box, and cutting it felt like the wrong first move. The combination felt like something that should exist in this space. The kind of person who seals a shop with this much deliberate care does not make the important things impossible to access. That would defeat the purpose. He went through the counter systematically. Every drawer, every compartment, parts catalogs, outdated, a pricing book from 12 years back, some pens, a ruler, a customer receipt book, carbon copies still in place, entries made in careful block capitals, the hand of someone who understood that paper records outlast memory. He read through the receipt entries. Each one was a service record: make, model, year, work performed, cost. The entries were detailed and consistent. The work was the kind he recognized from his own training. The systematic attention of a mechanic who understood that a motorcycle treated well would repay that treatment in ways that couldn't be precisely measured but were always eventually felt. At the back of the receipt book, tucked inside the back cover so that it was invisible unless you opened it fully and tilted it toward the light, there was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. 4 numbers, written in the same block capitals as the receipts. Nothing else. He went back to the steel box. He entered the numbers. The lock opened. He set the lid down carefully. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a set of ledgers. 5 of them, composition notebooks with black and white marbled covers, small enough to stack flat in the box. Each one labeled on the cover in permanent marker. Not dates, names. The second was a cassette tape, standard size with a white label on each face. On the A side, for whoever comes next. On the B side, play after you read. The third was an envelope, standard white letter envelope sealed. His name was written on the front. Not to the new owner, not to whom it may concern, not a description or a title. His name, Reed, 1 word, his first name only. Written in the same block capitals he was beginning to recognize. Written in the hand of a man he had never met, in a building he had owned for less than 2 hours, in a locked box under a counter he had found by accident. Reed picked up the envelope, set it back down, picked it up again, turned it over. The seal was intact. This had been placed here with the expectation that it would be found and opened in a specific order, under specific circumstances, by a specific person. He stood there and let his mind process what it was being asked to process, the way a mind sometimes handles impossible information by moving very quickly through it. The $19, the raised hand, the key, the 4 numbers, the receipt book, the coffee cup, the man in the newspaper photograph, with the attention of someone who was always watching. "What is this?" he said to the empty room. The building didn't answer. It held the question the way it held everything else, without judgment and without release. He put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket. He stacked the ledgers on the counter beside the box. He left the cassette where it was. Without a player, it was just an object. He thought briefly about where a person found a cassette player in the current century and concluded the answer was thrift stores and pawn shops and the drawers of people who never threw anything away. He locked the front door, stood on the step in the early evening air. Pueblo in October carried a cold that came down from the high country and didn't apologize for itself. He had not eaten since morning. He had not had anything to drink since bad coffee at the tire shop. He walked home. His room was 9 by 12 feet with a window facing the alley. His sleeping bag was on the floor because the mattress situation had resolved itself in someone else's favor during the last rotation. What he owned was arranged with the neatness that develops in men who have learned that disorder in small spaces makes small spaces unbearable. He sat on the sleeping bag with the envelope in his hands for a long time. He thought about the word on the front, his name, a familiarity or a specificity, and neither option was comfortable. A familiarity implied someone who knew him. A specificity implied someone who had chosen him. He was not accustomed to being chosen. The last time he had been chosen for something, the choosing had ended in a parking lot in Albuquerque. He put the envelope on the floor and looked at it. He needed to eat. He needed to sleep. He needed to think in the careful, limited way that a man with $118 and no job thinks about what comes next. One day, one thing, no grand calculations, because grand calculations require resources he didn't have. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. He unfolded it. It was not a long letter. The man who had written it had not been someone who used words to fill silence. What was written filled barely half the page, in the same block capitals, deliberate and precise, the hand of someone who had thought about every word before committing it to paper. Read. I have been watching for the right person for a long time. Longer than you would think reasonable. I almost gave up on the idea that the right person would come. You won't remember me, but I remember you. There was a cold morning about 9 years ago outside Walsenburg, a breakdown on the 25. I was traveling solo, which was my own foolishness, and the bike left me on the shoulder in a way I couldn't address without parts I didn't have on me. You stopped. You didn't ask who I rode with. You didn't ask anything. You diagnosed the problem in about 5 minutes, fabricated a temporary fix from what you had in your bags, and got me back on the road. I offered to pay you. You said, and I wrote this down because I knew I'd want to remember it. You said, this isn't that kind of thing. I didn't know your name that morning. I found it later. I watched from a distance for a long time after. I am not going to tell you I arranged for you to be here, because the truth is, I couldn't have arranged anything that specific. But I believe strongly enough to act on the belief that if I made the conditions right, if the building was there, if the price was right, if the moment was available, the right person would find it. You found it. The ledgers will tell you what I did here. The tape will tell you why. Read the ledgers first. The building is yours. What you do with it is your own business. But if you're inclined to use it the way I used it, there are people in this city who will understand what you're continuing. They will find you. Give it time. This is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Don't panic, just work. W.D. Reed read it twice. He set it on the floor and sat with it for a moment. Then he picked up the first ledger. The name on the cover was Dale Stanton. He opened it and began to read. The first entry was dated 11 years ago, written in the same block capitals, precise and unhurried. It read like a case file, except that no case file Reed had ever encountered opened the way this one did. Dale came in February. His wife had left in January. His truck was repossessed in early February. He had 2 kids in school and no way to get them there. He told me he didn't need charity. He needed someone to believe he was still worth betting on. I told him I wasn't in the charity business. I put him to work in the Bay at $12 an hour. He fixed bikes faster than anyone I'd had in 3 years. Within 6 weeks, I raised him to 16. He didn't know where the extra money came from. He thought it was merit. It was partly merit. It was also partly that I had been watching his situation and I believed the calculation was sound. Reed read on. Month by month, the man who had written this ledger tracked Dale Stanton the way a careful investor tracks a position he believes in. Not with sentiment, but with the disciplined attention of someone who has committed resources and intends to see the outcome through. The entries noted when attendance stabilized, when work quality improved. When Dale paid off the first of 2 debts, the ledger described only as having been settled through third-party arrangement. There was no self-congratulation in the writing. There was no record of gratitude, no scene of revelation. The closest thing to emotion in the entire ledger was a single line near the end of the 4th month. He doesn't know. He shouldn't. The work is the point, not the knowing. Reed set the ledger down. He picked it up again and read it from the beginning, slowly this time, because the first read had moved too fast for everything to land. The second read was different. It showed him what the first had missed, the systematic nature of what had been done here. Not random generosity, not impulse, something engineered. The man who had written this had identified a specific problem in a specific person's life, calculated the most efficient intervention, executed it through channels that kept his own involvement invisible, and then tracked the outcome with the same diligence a doctor tracks a recovering patient. He opened the second ledger. A woman named Nora Oakes, single mother, had come in for an estimate on a repair she couldn't afford and mentioned in passing that she was 2 months behind on rent. The ledger entry noted she didn't ask for help. People who don't ask are often the ones who need it most and will use it best. I made an arrangement with her landlord. She never knew. She caught up on her own within 3 months, which told me the situation was temporary and the person was sound. Third ledger. A mechanic named Pete Dillard let go from a competitor's shop on grounds the entry described, in the closest thing to outrage the ledger ever permitted itself, as a coward's way of avoiding paying a man what he'd earned. The man who had written these pages had hired Pete, taught him a specific way of doing things, and then spent 14 months quietly working through a contact to have Pete's former employer cited for wage theft. His role in initiating the complaint was nowhere in the record. The ledger entry simply noted the outcome. Pete received $4,200 in back wages. He bought his daughter a bike for Christmas. This is what money is for. Reed closed the third ledger. He sat on the sleeping bag in the 9 by 12 room with the ledger stacked in front of him and the letter on the floor, and thought about the word the letter had used. Responsibility, not gift, not opportunity, not inheritance. Responsibility. He had been given a building and a set of notebooks in a letter telling him he had been chosen based on 15 minutes on a highway 9 years ago. He had been left a system so carefully designed to be invisible that the people inside it never knew they were inside it. The question that arrived in his chest, not gently, was not why him. That was answered after a fashion by the letter. The question was bigger. Why had this man built such a thing and then left it to be found by a stranger rather than passed directly to someone he knew? Why make it contingent on the right person walking past the right auction at the right moment and raising a hand for $19? He lay back on the sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling. He was not going to sleep. He knew that before he closed his eyes. His mind was moving in the way it moved when he'd been handed a problem he couldn't yet see the edges of. The way an engine problem sometimes reveals itself as not one problem, but three nested inside each other, and the solution to the first doesn't work until you find the second. And the solution to the second doesn't work until you find the third. The light through the alley window went from black to gray. He got up. He was back at the building before 7. The lock turned faster this time. He'd found the angle. He pushed the door open and stood in the entry and breathed the smell of the place and felt again the thing he couldn't name. It was not comfort. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of walking into a room where something has been happening for a long time and will continue to happen with or without you. And what you feel in that moment is not possession, but proximity. He went to the service bay. He started working. Not because he had a plan, because his hands knew how to do this, and the knowing was the one thing that had not been stripped away by the years. The chapter, the parking lot in Albuquerque, the 9 by 12 room. His hands were what they had always been, before the identity was built around them and after the identity collapsed. A mechanic's hands. They knew what to do with an engine in front of them. He pulled the dust cover off the nearest bike, the Softail Deluxe, a 2008 Dusty, but in better condition than it had any right to be after 12 sealed years. Tires flat, battery dead, fuel gone to varnish in the tank, all expected, all addressable. Chrome with surface oxidation but no deep pitting. Engine case intact. Primary chain cover with no visible leaks, which meant the gaskets had held, which was either luck or the original work had been exceptional. He put his hand on the tank. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what you need." He was 3 hours into the teardown of the fuel system when he heard the knock at the front door. He set down the tool he was holding. He wiped his hands on the shop rag and walked out front. A woman stood outside the glass, shading her eyes to see through it. She was somewhere in her 60s, slight gray hair cut practically short, wearing a down vest and carrying a canvas bag. She had the look of someone who had been expecting to knock on this door for some time and was not particularly surprised that the moment had arrived. Reed unlocked the door and opened it. "You're the one who bought it," she said. "Not a question. I'm Reed Callahan. I know who you are." She said it without menace, simply as information. "My name is June Mercer. Can I come in?" He stepped back. She entered and looked around the front room with an expression that held something complicated. Recognition and grief and something else. Something closer to relief. And those things not entirely separate from each other. "I knew him," she said. "Walt Decker. He told me someone would come." She turned to look at Reed directly. "He didn't tell me it would take 12 years. Reed said nothing. He waited. June Mercer set her canvas bag on the counter and unzipped it. Inside was a cassette player, a small Sony portable, the kind that ran on AA batteries. She set it on the counter beside the coffee cup Reed had not moved. "I've had this in a drawer for 10 years, she said. "Walt gave it to me when he closed the building. He died 2 years after he shut the doors. In a hospital in Colorado Springs, no family left to call. Before he died, he gave me two things, this player and instructions. He said when the right person found the tape, bring them this. He said I'd know when it happened." She reached into the bag and produced two AA batteries, setting them on the counter with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this errand for a decade. "How did you know?" Reed asked. "My grandson saw the county auction listing online. He thought it was funny, a $19 building. He sent me the screenshot." She looked at the cassette player. "I called the auctioneer's office. They told me a man named Reed Callahan had purchased the property." Reed went to the steel box and retrieved the cassette tape. He came back to the counter. He put the batteries in the player. He put the tape in. He looked at June Mercer for a moment, and she looked back at him with the composed patience of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and intends to be present when it finally arrives. He pressed play. The hiss of old magnetic tape. Then a voice. Low, unhurried, the voice of a man who spoke the way he wrote, with the discipline of someone who had thought about every word before committing it. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, "then you found the box. You found the combination and you made it through the locked door, which means you're probably the person I've been waiting for. Or close enough that the distinction doesn't matter." June Mercer stood very still beside Reed. She was looking at the cassette player with the focused attention of a person who has waited a long time to hear a specific thing and intends to hear every word of it. "I'm not going to tell you who I was or ask you to believe I was anything special. I ran a motorcycle shop in Pueblo, Colorado for 22 years. I fixed bikes for people who could pay me and for people who couldn't. And I didn't treat those transactions differently because the machine doesn't know the difference, and neither does the person who needs to get home. But there was another thing I did. It's in the ledgers. What I want you to understand is that what I built was not charity. I want to be clear about that because charity creates something I didn't want to create. Charity creates a recipient. What I built creates a participant. Every person in those ledgers participated in their own recovery. I adjusted the conditions. They did the work. Those are different things, and the difference matters more than it might sound like it does." Reed's hands were flat on the counter. He was watching the cassette player as if watching it carefully enough might show him the man who had recorded what it held. "The building knows what it's for. I know that sounds like something a foolish old man would say. I'm saying it anyway. There are machines in that shop that haven't run in years, and they will run. There are people in this city who carry debts they don't know how to pay. Some of them will find you. Some of them you'll have to find first. That's the work. The ledgers are the map. I want to tell you about the knucklehead." June Mercer made a small sound, barely a breath. "The knucklehead was my father's. He bought it new and he rode it for 30 years. When he couldn't ride anymore, he serviced it himself until he couldn't do that either. And then he brought it to me. He said, 'Walt, keep this right.' He didn't mean just mechanically right. He meant in the way that a thing can be kept right when the person who loved it can't keep it right themselves. He meant understand that the object carries something the object itself can't contain. That's what the building is. Keep it right, Walt." The tape clicked to silence. Neither of them spoke for a moment. June Mercer cleared her throat. "He was a complicated man," she said. "Not in a difficult way. In the way that people are complicated when they've thought about things longer than most people think about things." Reed was still looking at the cassette player. He was thinking about a morning on Highway 25 near Walsenburg. He had a specific memory of it now. It surfaced with a clarity he hadn't anticipated. An older man traveling alone, a big touring bike with a fuel delivery issue he'd traced quickly because the symptoms were familiar. He'd made the fix with a piece of hose from his own kit and a clamp he'd been carrying as backup. 15 minutes, maybe 20. The man had offered money and Reed had said what he always said in those situations. The thing you said when someone tried to turn a human obligation into a transaction. This isn't that kind of thing. He hadn't thought about the exchange again after the man rode away. He'd gotten back on his bike and continued south, and the morning had filed itself in the category of things that happen and then recede, which is where most mornings go. Apparently that morning had not receded. Apparently it had been noted. Reed picked up the fourth ledger. He opened it and found his own name on the first page. Callahan, Reed D. Below the name, in the same block capitals he had been reading for the past 12 hours, a first entry dated 9 years ago, the week after the morning on the 25th. And the first line of it read, "I saw this man stop on a highway for a stranger without asking a single question about who the stranger was or what he was worth. He diagnosed the problem in 5 minutes and fixed it with what he had available and refused payment by saying something I wrote down because I knew I'd want to remember it. This isn't that kind of thing. I didn't get his name that morning. I got it later. What I know from that one interaction is this. The kind of person who does what he did without thinking about it, that's not something you learn. That's something you either have or you don't. I'm going to watch for a while before I do anything else." Reed's hands had gone still on the open pages. He read the first entry again. He turned to the next page and found what Walt Decker had written about him across the following 9 years. The pattern of a life observed from outside, recorded with the unsentimental precision of a man who had decided that what he was watching was worth the effort of documentation. The years in the chapter, the work, the quality of the work, the specific incident that had ended the membership, described from a perspective Reed had never been able to access, from the outside, from a distance, by someone who had drawn a conclusion from it that Reed himself had never been able to draw. He gave up everything he'd built to do the right thing for one person, and he did it knowing what it would cost him. That's not a character flaw. That's the character itself, made visible by pressure. Most people given that choice make the other one. He made this one. The last entry was dated 4 months before the auction. I don't know if this will work. I'm not certain of much anymore. What I'm certain of is this: the building needs someone who has had things taken away and knows the cost and still chooses to give. I've only met a few people in my life who qualify without reservation. Reed qualifies. The rest is up to him. Reed closed the fourth ledger. He set it on the counter above his head and sat down on the floor of the front room, with his back against the display case, the same position he'd come to occupy when thinking in small spaces. Back against something solid, floor under him, nowhere left to drift. June Mercer looked at him for a moment. She picked up her canvas bag. "Are you going to stay?" she said. The question was direct enough to require a direct answer. He thought about the $19, the raised hand, the key, the 4 numbers, the name on an envelope in a locked box in a sealed building. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded as if that were a more honest answer than yes. She moved toward the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "When you decide," she said, "there are things I can tell you. About the people Walt worked with, about how he ran things, about what he built and how long it took him." She looked back at the room one more time, the look of someone making a comparison between memory and present, finding the two closer than she'd expected. "It looks the same," she said quietly. "I haven't decided yet if that's very good or very strange." She left. Reed sat on the floor of the front room of a building he had purchased for $19, with the fourth ledger beside him, and the letter from a dead man in his jacket pocket, and the smell of old oil and old coffee in the air around him. He thought about the word Walt had used: responsibility. He thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who was no longer alive to be questioned about it, based on 15 minutes on a highway 9 years ago that Reed had already forgotten by the time he'd reached the next town. He thought about the first 3 ledgers and the fourth one with his name on it, and the blank fifth one still sitting in the steel box, waiting. He got up. He went back to the service bay. He picked up the wrench he'd set down when June Mercer knocked. He went back to work. Iris Boland's office was above a title company on the east side of Pueblo, a second-floor space with the organized density of someone who had worked in the same rooms for decades and had a system for everything that looked like chaos from the outside and was not. She was in her early 70s, brisk and direct, the kind of woman who had learned long ago that efficiency was its own form of respect, and wasted words were a form of disrespect she was not willing to extend to anyone. She pushed a folder across the desk before Reed had fully settled into the chair. "Sign where I've flagged," she said. "Initial the tab pages. The account transfer completes within 3 business days." Reed looked at the folder. What account? She looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has asked a question she has been waiting years to answer and intends to answer precisely. "Walt set up a trust account before he died," she said. "Hayes Moto Legacy LLC, separate entity from the dissolved Hayes Moto LLC, which is why it didn't transfer with the property and didn't appear in any of the auction documentation. The account was established specifically for whoever came through that door and stayed. She let a beat pass. $44,000, she said. He saved it over the last 2 years before he closed. He said the new person would need working capital. He said starting from zero is hard, but starting from nothing is impossible. And he wasn't trying to test anyone's endurance. He was trying to give someone a real chance. Reed sat with that for a moment. $44,000 set aside by a man who had died in a hospital in Colorado Springs with no family, who had spent 22 years building something invisible out of his own resources, and who had calculated precisely how much a stranger would need to continue what he had built. It's been drawing interest for 10 years, Iris said. It's closer to 46 now. Reed picked up the pen. He read every page before he signed it, the way he read everything, methodically, looking for the specific language where the actual meaning lived, the place between what something said and what it was designed to do. Iris watched him read without impatience or comment. She had the stillness of someone who had worked alongside careful people long enough to recognize the quality and value it. When he finished signing, she produced a second folder. Walt left instructions for me, she said, not just about the money, about the people. She opened it. 11 years ago, he gave me a list. People in Pueblo who had been touched by the system. Some of them Walt told directly. After enough time had passed, after the help had done what it was supposed to do, and the knowing could no longer compromise the outcome. Others found out through me after he was gone. All of them agreed, being some years after the fact, to be available if the building came back to life. She looked at the list. Not all of them are still in Pueblo. People move. But I've maintained contact with 11 of them. They know that if the right person took over the building, I would call. Reed looked at her. Did you call them? Tuesday morning, she said. Right after June called me to tell me you'd listened to the tape and you hadn't left. He absorbed that. What did they say? 10 out of 11 said yes immediately. She paused in the way she paused, briefly and with purpose. The 11th asked if you were a good mechanic. Reed waited. I told him Walt Decker thought so, Iris said. Another pause. He said that was good enough. Reed drove back to Thatcher Avenue in the thin morning light and unlocked the building and stood for a moment in the entry, the way he had taken to doing, letting the smell of the place settle around him before he moved into it. He had slept 4 hours on the sleeping bag and woken with the clarity that sometimes comes from insufficient sleep in the presence of a problem the mind has been working on without the body's knowledge. He had work to do. He understood that clearly. The trust account was capital, and capital deployed without work was just money running out. The building needed to generate income before it could generate anything else. He went to the service bay and uncovered the second bike, a 2004 Road King with surface corrosion on the exhaust and a fuel system that would need the same treatment he'd given the Softail. He began working through the assessment the way he always began, hands on the machine, reading it by touch and by the intelligence that accumulates in fingers over 20 years of mechanical work. He was an hour into it when he heard the front door. He walked out. The man standing just inside was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders and thick in the hands, with the posture of someone who had carried physical work for most of his adult life and had stopped noticing the weight because the weight had become the posture. He was wearing a gray work shirt with a patch on the chest that Reed couldn't read from across the room. He looked around the front space with an expression that held recognition and something more complicated than nostalgia. The look of a man returning to a place that had been significant and finding it changed and unchanged simultaneously, and not yet certain which of those things was harder to absorb. "You're Reed Callahan," the man said. "Yeah, my name is Lou Briggs." He walked a few steps into the room and stopped at the Softail, put his hand briefly on the tank, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "I heard the building was open." "You worked here," Reed said. Lou Briggs looked at him. 18 years ago. Walt hired me when I was in a situation. He said it the way people say things they have condensed through years of repetition, the original weight compressed but not lost. I thought it was just a job. He looked at the service counter. I found out later it was something more than that. "You're on the list," Reed said. "Iris Boland's list." Lou Briggs turned. 11 people. She called me Tuesday. He was working something through in his expression. I came because I figured whoever was here should know something. He stopped, then said it the way a man says a thing he has been deciding how to say for 3 days and has finally decided to say directly, "There's a problem coming." Reed kept his face still. "A lawyer named Dennis Crane," Lou said. "He's been watching this property since Walt closed it. Made 2 plays for it through county channels, acquisition arguments, procedural challenges, and got blocked both times. Walt knew about him. Walt managed it, kept the necessary filings current, knew where the pressure points were." He paused. "Walt's been dead for 10 years. That management is gone, and Crane's been waiting." Reed said nothing. He waited the way he had learned to wait, without filling silence, without moving the conversation toward the conclusion he expected, letting the other person arrive at what they were going to say in their own time. "He's going to challenge the auction," Lou said. "Argue procedural deficiency in the sale process. Combine it with a lien claim he's been holding for years. He's got a relationship with someone in the county recorder's office. I don't know who, but it goes back. He's been holding that lien argument in reserve, waiting for the right moment to deploy it." "How do you know this?" Reed said. "Because Crane called me last week, before the auction." Lou looked at the floor, then back at Reed, with the directness of a man who understands that what he's about to say does not reflect well on him. He'd heard through county channels that the building was going to surplus. He asked if I knew anything about the property's history that might be relevant to a title challenge. He was fishing. "But you didn't call anyone," Reed said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "No," Lou said. "I didn't." He looked at the floor again. "I should have." Reed thought about the ledger entries, about the principle Walt had written without calling it a principle, embedded in the specific decisions rather than stated as a rule. Trust the pattern, not the story. He looked at Lou Briggs' hands, at the work shirt, at the way the man stood, not performing honesty, inhabiting it, with the discomfort of someone who knows they came up short and is not looking to be absolved of it. "What do you do now?" Reed said. "Body shop," Lou said. 3 blocks east. Small operation, me and 2 other guys. You made it work." "I did, because 18 years ago, Walt Decker hired me when no one else would, and paid me better than I deserved for the first 2 months while I found my footing. I didn't understand until Iris explained it to me the year after he closed what the system was, what he'd been doing." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had the controlled weight of someone who feels something deeply and has learned to carry it without display. "I spent 10 years wondering if I'd ever get a chance to do something with that. Tuesday, she called me and told me the building was open." He looked at Reed directly. "I came to tell you about Crane," he said, "and I came to tell you that whatever you need, mechanic referrals, bodywork, someone to show up somewhere when it matters, I'm in. The same way Walt was in for me." Reed looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Find out what you can about what Crane is planning specifically. You said he has a contact in the recorder's office. I need to know what he's moving toward." Lou nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped and looked at the knucklehead on its center stand. "Walt's father's," he said quietly. "Yeah, he never wrote it. I worked here 18 months and I never saw him put a leg over it. He just kept it right." Lou looked at the machine for a long moment. He used to say that bike wasn't going anywhere until it had somewhere worth going to. He left. Reed stood in the front room. He thought about a lawyer who had made 2 attempts on this property across 11 years and had been blocked both times by a man who had known the pressure points. That man was gone. The blocks were gone with him. Except, he went to the steel box. He pulled out the second ledger, the one he'd read the first time without stopping at the pages in the middle. He opened it and went through it carefully now, not reading for the case history, but looking for the specific thing Lou had described. Evidence that Walt had anticipated Crane, had prepared a response. In the middle of the ledger, folded flat between 2 pages so that it would be invisible unless you opened the cover fully and went through every leaf, there was a single sheet of paper. Reed unfolded it. Walt's block capitals, but tighter than usual. The hand of someone compressing a significant amount of information into limited space. Crane tried twice. First time, 2007. Acquisition argument, procedural. Addressed through county channel with documentation of proper notice. Second time, 2012. Lien claim, Southwest Capital Group. Second mortgage instrument dated 14 years ago. Addressed through counterfiling in 2009. Statutory argument recording procedure deficiency in original Southwest Capital filing. Counterfiling is still in the record and should still hold. But the evidence that makes it hold is in the county archive. The original submission records from when Southwest Capital filed, which show the procedural deficiency that renders the lien recording invalid. Those records need to stay accessible. If they're moved or reclassified, the argument becomes substantially harder to make. Crane knows about the counterfiling. He'll try to work around it. He's patient. He's been patient before. Whoever reads this, the records matter. Get to them before he does. Reed sat with the paper in his hands for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Iris Boland. She answered on the first ring. "Crane's going to file," Reed said. "Lien claim plus procedural challenge on the auction." Walt left a note in the ledgers about it. The critical evidence is original submission records for something called Southwest Capital Group in the county archive. Walt's counterfiling from 2009 is still in the record, but the evidence that supports it is in the archive. And if Crane has a contact in the recorder's office, he's going to try to move those records, Iris said. She said it the way she said most things, without alarm, with the composure of someone who had been thinking about this possibility for a long time and had not been surprised to have it confirmed. Reed said nothing. "I need you to know something," Iris said. "When Walt set up the trust and gave me the list and the instructions, he didn't only tell me about the money and the people. He told me about Crane. He told me the lien argument existed and that Crane would use it eventually. He said the next person would need legal help, and he told me who to call." "Frank Whitmore," Reed said, reading from the list in his mind. "Retired property attorney, 31 years in Pueblo." "I called him Tuesday morning," Iris said. "Right after I called the others. He's already reviewed the 2009 counterfiling and the statutory argument. He says the position is defensible. He also says the archive records are essential, and that if they're moved before he can access them, the argument becomes substantially more difficult." "Then we need someone who knows that archive," Reed said. There was a brief pause. "Number 7 on the list," Iris said. "A woman named Diane Forsyth. She was a county records clerk for 19 years. She retired 4 years ago. Walt paid her medical expenses in 2008 through a third-party arrangement when she was diagnosed with something significant. She found out about it 2 years later. She knows every filing system, every archive location, and every procedural backdoor in that recorder's office. She still has friends who work there." Reed waited. "She called me Wednesday morning," Iris said, "before I even had a chance to call her. She'd heard through her contacts at the recorder's office that a transfer order had been submitted, specific boxes of records being moved to off-site storage. She called me to ask if it was connected to the building." Reed was very still. "When is the transfer?" "Wednesday," Iris said. 2 days from now. Then she needs to go in tomorrow." "She already knows," Iris said. "She's going in at 7. The papers arrived Monday morning at 7:42. Reed heard the knock from the service bay where he was pulling the carburetor on the Road King. He set the carb down, wiped his hands on the shop rag, and walked to the front. The process server was young, uncomfortable, with the expression of someone who performs an unpleasant job and hasn't yet arrived at peace with it. He extended the envelope with the efficiency of a man who has been trained to deliver and leave. "Reed Callahan?" "Yeah, you've been served," said quickly without inflection, and then the young man was already turning before Reed had fully closed his hand around the envelope. Reed went back inside. He set the envelope on the service counter beside the receipt book and the fifth ledger and the photograph of Walt Decker from the newspaper commendation, which he had placed behind the counter 3 days ago, not as a memorial, but as a daily reminder of the quality of attention required by the work. He did not open the envelope. He went back to the carburetor. He worked for 40 minutes. The focused work of a man who understands that panic is expensive and that the antidote to panic is the task directly in front of you that needs doing. He cleaned the carb, rebuilt the float assembly, set the needle, reinstalled. When he primed the system and the engine caught and settled into idle, the sound of a machine that hadn't run in 12 years finding its rhythm. That sound did something to the tension in his chest that no amount of reasoning had been able to do. He let it run for 3 minutes, made adjustments by ear, then shut it down. He went to the counter and opened the envelope. The filing was 30 pages. Reed was not a lawyer, but he was a man who had spent 11 years inside an organization with a complex internal structure, and that organization had taught him to read documents carefully, to find the specific language where the real content lived, to distinguish between what something said and what it was designed to accomplish. He read the filing twice. The core argument was what Lou had described: procedural challenge to the auction's validity combined with a lien claim. But the procedural challenge was more specific than he'd expected. Dennis Crane was arguing that the county had failed to provide adequate notice of the auction to parties with a potential interest in the property, specifically a company identified as Meridian Property Holdings, LLC. Reed had never heard of Meridian Property Holdings. He photographed every page and sent the images to Iris with a single message. Filing just arrived. Who is Meridian Property Holdings? Her reply came back in 4 minutes. I don't know, calling Frank now. Reed put his phone in his pocket. He had 3 bikes scheduled for the afternoon and a 4th waiting at the back of the queue. He had Casey Harwell at the bench working through a valve adjustment with the focused, unhurried attention Reed had noted from the first day. A 19-year-old kid who asked precise questions, made mistakes and acknowledged them directly, and worked with the quality that develops in people who taught themselves things because they genuinely needed to know them, rather than because someone required it. He'd hired Casey 6 days after opening the front door. The kid had come in looking for work, had no certification and no formal training, but had been taking apart and reassembling small engines since he was 12. Reed had given him 3 diagnostic tests, not written, practical, show me what you see, on 3 bikes with 3 different problems. Casey had found 2 of the 3 without being told what to look for. Reed had offered him $11 an hour, which was below what the work eventually warranted and above what Casey had been making at the gas station on Fortino. He'd told Casey there was one shop policy he needed to understand before he started. If someone comes in and they need work done and they can't pay, we do the work, Reed had said, every time within reason. Use judgment about the situation. But the default is we help. Casey had thought about it. What if they take advantage? Some will, Reed said. Most won't. The ones who won't are the reason for the policy. Casey had nodded with the look of someone filing information away in a place where it would do work later. Frank Whitmore arrived at the building that afternoon carrying a leather briefcase that had been used long enough to have developed character. He was in his mid-70s, lean, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and never lost the habit of composure in rooms where things mattered. He set the briefcase on the service counter and opened it. He spread the filing on the counter in front of him with 3 pages of his own notes beside it. He looked at the documents the way Reed looked at a machine with an unfamiliar fault. Not with alarm, but with the diagnostic attention of someone who has encountered this category of problem before and knows that it has a structure that can be understood. Meridian Property Holdings, Frank said, is a shell company, registered in Nevada 14 months ago. I've already traced it 3 levels and I need more time to reach the beneficial owner, but the registration dates are instructive. He looked up at Reed. Crane went out on his own 3 years ago. He started moving on this property through county channels approximately 14 months ago, which is precisely when Meridian was registered. He set up the entity specifically for this purpose, which means, Reed said, which means he's not just a lawyer with a client. Frank said it without drama, the way a man states a conclusion he arrived at before he came into the room. He is the client. Frank picked up one of the filing pages. The lien, Southwest Capital Group. I know this instrument. Walt showed it to me in 2009. We counterfiled based on a specific statutory argument about the recording procedure Southwest used at the time of original filing. The counterfiling is still in the record. Crane knows about it. His argument in this challenge is that the counterfiling has a deficiency of its own, a technical issue with the notarization on one of the supporting documents. Does it? Reed said. Frank looked at him steadily. The notary whose stamp appears on the 2009 document retired in 2011 and died in 2015. The commission records for that notary were archived, and there is a question about whether the archive is complete. He paused with the precision of a man choosing his next words carefully. Crane has done his homework. Is the notarization deficient? Technically, there's an argument. Frank set the page down. A better argument is that the underlying recording deficiency in Southwest Capital's original lien is dispositive regardless of any subsequent procedural questions. A fatally defective original instrument cannot be rehabilitated by the debtor's response to it. My argument is stronger, but Crane's argument is not frivolous. Reed understood the rest of that sentence without it being spoken. If Crane got in front of the wrong judge, The stronger argument might not be the one that prevailed. Can we challenge the judge assignment? On what grounds? Frank closed the filing. I need a documented conflict of interest, not a pattern I've observed over 20 years of practice. He paused. There is a procedural technicality in the way Crane structured the filing that gives me standing to request a specific assignment. It's a thin argument, but it's an argument. I intend to make it. What do we need beyond that, Reed said. The original Southwest Capitol recording submission documents from the county archive, Frank said. The specific submission records from the time of original filing, which would show the procedural deficiency that renders the lien recording invalid. Those records should be in the county archive. Diane Forsyth is going in tomorrow morning, Reed said. Frank looked at him for a moment. I know. She called me this morning before I came here. She said she's been waiting to do something useful for 10 years. She wants to know what specifically I need. Reed looked at him. I already told her, Frank said. He allowed himself something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. She's going in at 7. The transfer order is scheduled for execution at 9. The 2 hours between 7 and 9 on Tuesday morning ran at a different pace than most hours. Reed was in the service bay at 5, not because he'd planned to be, because sleep had become an abstraction he couldn't afford, and the work was present, and the work was what kept the rest of him organized. He had found the electrical fault in a 2001 Road King that had defeated 2 previous shops. The owner, a woman named Patrice Monroe, who drove a hard bargain and had the frustration of someone who had been given wrong answers before, had described the fault with a precision that told Reed she knew her machine even if she couldn't diagnose it herself. He traced it to a ground wire with an intermittent break in the insulation, the kind of fault that hides when you look directly at it and reveals itself only when you're attending to something else. He'd found it at 2 in the morning and spent the remaining hours on the maintenance work the bike needed because the machine was there, and the tools were there, and the hours were there. At 7:15, his phone buzzed. A text from Diane Forsyth, whom he hadn't met but who had been texting him updates with the efficient brevity of someone who has spent decades working in institutions where information needs to travel accurately and fast. In the archive. Records are here. Starting now. At 8:40, done. Photographed everything. Sending to Frank now. At 9:03, transfer executed. Box is gone. Good thing we didn't wait. Reed set the phone down on the workbench. Casey was at the other bench with the valve adjustment, and he'd heard enough of the intermittent messages to understand that something was happening, and he had the sense to keep his eyes on his work. Frank Whitmore filed a preliminary response to the challenge by 2 that afternoon, establishing Reed's standing and buying time. He did it from the service counter because Reed had asked him to come to the building rather than handling it from an office somewhere else. And Frank had come without comment, spreading his papers on the counter beside the receipt book, the way a man works who understands that the location of the work matters less than the quality of it. By Tuesday evening, Reed's phone was doing something it hadn't done since he'd arrived in Pueblo. It rang with purpose. Hank Voss, who had been the first paying customer, who had left his fat bob for a primary chain tensioner repair and spread word down 3 blocks of Thatcher Avenue, called to ask if there was anything he could do. June Mercer called without asking and simply said she was coming by Wednesday morning with food because she had noticed Reed wasn't leaving for meals. Lou Briggs called to say his contact at Crane's former firm had confirmed that the transfer order had been requested by Crane's contact before the challenge was filed, which meant Crane had known what was in those records and had moved to make them inaccessible before the litigation was even on paper. Lou said he'd be willing to provide a sworn statement about the conversation with his contact if Frank needed it. Frank said he needed it. That night, Reed sat at the service counter with the 5th ledger and the pen he kept in the drawer Walt had stocked with pens, and he added a line to the notes he'd been making. The system defends itself, he wrote, not through power, through people. He set the pen down. He thought about what that meant precisely, not as a sentiment, but as a mechanics problem. A system that defends itself doesn't require its designer to be present for the defense. It requires that the people inside it understand what the system is for, so that when the system is threatened, the threat makes its nature visible to everyone who cares about the thing being threatened. Walt Decker hadn't built a business. He had built a network of obligations, invisible, unclaimed, unreceipted, and 10 years after his death, those obligations were present and organized and prepared. Reed looked at the photograph behind the counter. Walt Decker in the newspaper commendation. The man who had never smiled for a camera because he was always somewhere else in his mind, always watching, always calculating what the pattern meant. "You built this to last," Reed said to the photograph. The photograph held his attention without offering an answer, the same way the building held everything it had been asked to hold. The injunction hearing was the next morning. Reed locked the building at 9:45. He had expected to go to the courthouse alone. He had not expected what was standing on the sidewalk in front of the building when he came out. Lou Briggs was there, in a sport coat that had been brought out of storage for the occasion. Diane Forsyth was there. Reed recognized her from the photograph Iris had texted, a compact, self-possessed woman in her 60s who had the look of someone who had spent decades navigating institutional systems and knew exactly where every lever was. June Mercer was there. Iris Boland was there, in the composed state of a woman who had maintained accounts and kept lists and paid utility bills for 10 years in the service of a dead man's instructions, and who intended to observe this morning with the same precision she'd applied to all of it. And beside Iris, a man Reed didn't recognize, mid-50s, the build of someone who had done outdoor work for most of his life, wearing a clean flannel shirt and standing with the stillness of a person who has driven a long distance and is not going to make anything of it. The man extended his hand. "Dale Stanton," he said, "First Ledger." Reed shook his hand, the first name in the First Ledger. Reed had read his entire story. The February the wife left, the truck repossessed, the 2 kids and no way to get them to school, the $12 an hour that became 16, the debt settled through third-party arrangement. He had never expected to stand across from him on a sidewalk in Pueblo. "Iris called me," Dale said. "I drove down from Denver last night. He said it as information, not as a claim on gratitude. Walt helped me when I didn't know I needed help. Showing up is the least of what I owe." 2 more people arrived from the same car, then another car. By the time Frank Whitmore said it was time to go in, there were 9 of them standing on Thatcher Avenue. 9 people who had been touched by a system they hadn't known they were inside until years after the fact, who had been called by a woman with a list on a Tuesday morning and had made their way here through routes that required rearranging their lives in the way that real things require. Reed looked at each of them in turn. He thought about what Walt had written on the tape. "There are people in this city who will understand what you're continuing. They will find you. Give it time." He hadn't given it time. He had given it 11 days. Frank Whitmore put a brief hand on Reed's shoulder, the restrained gesture of a man who feels something but expresses it exactly. "Let's go," he said. The courtroom was a working room, fluorescent, institutional, carrying the bureaucratic weight of a space where difficult things get decided routinely and without ceremony. Dennis Crane was already at his table when they filed in. A man in his mid-50s with the groomed, confident bearing of someone who had spent his career expecting rooms to arrange themselves around him. He had 2 people with him, an associate and a woman taking notes. Crane looked at the group following Reed and Frank into the gallery. He looked at them for a moment and something moved in his expression. Not fear, not yet, but the specific recognition of a variable he had not accounted for. He had filed against a man with $19 and no resources. He had not anticipated 9 people. Reed sat at the table beside Frank. He did not look at Crane again. He looked at the front of the room and breathed with the controlled deliberateness of a man who has learned that the moments when you have no control are precisely the moments when your response to having no control is the only thing left to manage. The judge entered. Reed looked at Frank, who had leaned slightly closer. "Judge Patricia Reyes," Frank said quietly. "She rules on the law. She's not going to be moved by anything except what the evidence shows." Crane argued first. He was good at it, organized, precise, moving the procedural argument through its sequence with the fluency of a man who had prepared thoroughly and expected to be the most prepared person in the room. He presented the auction challenge and the lien claim with the confidence of someone who believes he is the only one who has done his homework. Frank responded without matching Crane's smoothness. He was more deliberate, more specific, the kind of man who has practiced long enough to understand that a judge like Patricia Reyes is not moved by fluency, but by precision. He laid out the lien argument methodically. The original recording deficiency, the photographic evidence from the archive, the counterfiling from 2009, and the statutory basis for it. He laid it out the way Reed would explain a mechanical failure to someone who needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong and exactly why the proposed fix addressed the actual problem. Then Frank said something that changed the temperature in the room. "Your Honor," he said in the same unhurried tone, "I'd like to bring to the court's attention information that has emerged regarding the availability of the archival records central to this matter. The original submission records for the Southwest Capitol lien were scheduled for transfer to off-site storage yesterday morning. That transfer was requested through the county recorder's office before the filing of this challenge, by a party we have reason to believe was acting in coordination with the challenging party." He produced a document and passed it to the clerk. "We have a sworn statement from a former county records employee identifying the specific sequence of events. We have the county transfer request documentation. And we have the archival records themselves, accessed and photographed before the transfer was executed." Crane was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is Mr. Crane." Judge Reyes said his name without raising her voice, in the way of a judge who has never needed volume to establish authority. "Sit down." Crane sat. Judge Reyes looked at the document Frank had submitted. She looked at it for a long time. The room held the quality of silence that falls when everyone present simultaneously understands that something important is happening. She looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "are you suggesting that evidence relevant to this proceeding was subject to an attempt at suppression?" "I'm presenting the chronology, Your Honor," Frank said, and asking the court to draw its own conclusions. The silence held another moment. Then Judge Reyes said, "I'm going to take a brief recess." Reed sat at the table and did not speak and did not move. Behind him in the gallery, 9 people waited. Frank sat with the stillness of a man who has done everything that could be done and understands that what happens next is no longer in his hands. 17 minutes. Judge Reyes returned. "The motion for preliminary injunction is denied," she said without preamble. She looked at her notes. "The court finds that the challenge to the auction's validity does not meet the threshold required for emergency injunctive relief, particularly in light of the documented counterfiling from 2009 and the archival evidence regarding the original lien recording procedure. The court further notes for the record that the circumstances surrounding the scheduling of the archival record transfer warrant review. I am issuing a preservation order covering all county records related to the Southwest Capitol filing, effective immediately. The underlying challenge may proceed on the merits schedule. Mr. Callahan retains operational control of the property pending final resolution." She looked around the room once. "We're adjourned." She left. Reed sat at the table for a moment after she was gone. Frank put his hand on the table between them. Not on Reed's arm, just on the table. The gesture of a man who feels something strongly and expresses it exactly. "That's a good day," Frank said. "Is it over?" "The injunction is over." Frank began organizing his papers. "The challenge is not. Crane will continue. But continuing costs money and professional exposure. The preservation order is a message. A calculating man looks at his cost-benefit at this point and considers whether the asset is worth the exposure." He looked at Reed. "Crane is calculating. He's always calculating." Reed stood. He turned to the gallery. The 9 people were already on their feet. Dale Stanton was talking to Lou Briggs in the low voice of 2 men who have never met but recognize each other as belonging to the same category of thing. June Mercer stood with Iris Boland, both of them holding the composed expression of people for whom the outcome had confirmed something they already believed rather than the other way around. Diane Forsyth caught Reed's eye across the room. She nodded once. He nodded back. Outside the courthouse in the October air, the group stood on the steps together. There was no celebration, no dramatic release. People who have done something difficult together often express the completion of it quietly, through the proximity that doesn't require words and doesn't need them. Lou Briggs stood beside Reed. "What happens now?" he said. "We go back to work," Reed said. Lou looked at him. A small nod. "That's what Walt would have said." Dale Stanton shook Reed's hand before he walked to his car. "I read about you," Dale said. "In the Ledger. Walt wrote about you." He said it without performance, just as a fact that had turned out to be confirmed by what he had witnessed today. He said you were the right person. Reed looked at him. "He was right," Dale said. He walked to his car. Iris Boland was the last to leave. She stood with Reed on the steps after the others had gone. "Crane's not finished," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "Walt always said the work was never finished." She picked up her bag. "That's not a warning. It's a description. She left. Reed stood alone on the courthouse steps for a moment. The city moved around him, traffic and pedestrians, and the ordinary motion of a Tuesday afternoon in a working city. He had been in Pueblo for less than 3 weeks. He had purchased a building for $19 and found a dead man's life's work inside it, and been handed the continuation of that work without being asked whether he wanted it. He had not been asked. He had raised his hand. He walked to his bike. He rode back to Thatcher Avenue. He unlocked the front door, went inside, set his jacket on the counter. He looked at the fifth ledger. He picked up the pen. Today, he wrote, 9 people who had never met came to a courthouse because a dead man helped them when they needed it. The system worked. Not because it was powerful, because it was real. He set the pen down. He went to the service bay. He picked up the wrench. He went back to work. Crane went quiet 3 weeks after the courthouse. Not gone. Frank Whitmore made that clear when he called on a Thursday afternoon with the measured delivery he used when conveying information that required careful interpretation. The challenge was still technically active. Crane's name was still on the filing. The case was still on the docket. But the motion practice had stopped. The aggressive timeline had collapsed. The man who had filed 30 pages on a Monday morning and moved for emergency injunctive relief within 72 hours had, in the 3 weeks since Judge Reyes denied that relief and issued the preservation order, done absolutely nothing. He's calculating, Frank said, which is what I expected. The bar complaint I filed last week over the archive situation is now a factor in his calculation. He paused in the precise way he paused when he wanted the next sentence to land without cushioning. A careful man looks at his exposure and decides whether the asset is worth the cost. The preservation order made his main evidentiary approach unavailable. The bar complaint added professional risk. And the courthouse appearance, 9 people, the documentation we produced, told him that this is not an isolated man with no resources. Reed thanked him and hung up. He stood in the service bay with the phone in his hand and thought about what contained meant. Not finished, not resolved, contained. He had learned in the years when the consequences of underestimating a waiting problem had been paid in ways that couldn't be recovered, to treat a quiet threat with the same attention he gave an active one. A problem that stopped moving was not a problem that had stopped existing. It was a problem that was thinking. But contained was something. Contained was enough to work with. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the knucklehead. He had been working on it in the hours between paying jobs, the way a man works on something that matters to him. Not with urgency, but with consistency, coming back to it every day, adding a little more to what he understood and what he had done, letting the machine tell him what it needed in the language of old metal and old design that required a different kind of listening than modern work. Slower, more patient, the kind that didn't look for answers so much as wait for them to surface. The engine was sound. He had confirmed that in the first detailed inspection and reconfirmed it each time he came back. The primary drive was tight. The transmission moved through every gear cleanly. What needed work was the fuel system, the electrical, and the cosmetic elements that 12 years of sealed storage had affected. Chrome oxidized past what surface treatment could address. Leather dried past the point where conditioning alone would restore it to anything worth calling restoration. For the chrome, Walt had connected him through the ledgers indirectly, a reference to a restoration craftsman that Lou Briggs had helped Reed trace. Ed Garza ran a restoration shop in the south part of Pueblo, a one-man operation that had been doing vintage work for 30 years, the kind of shop that had no sign out front and no website, and no need for either because everyone who needed to find it had already been sent there by someone who knew. When Reed called and said Walt Decker's name, there was a silence on the line before Ed said quietly that he'd come by and take a look, and that whatever Walt's building needed from him, the price would be right. He'd come the following Tuesday, examine the chrome components with the focused, unhurried attention of a craftsman who had spent 3 decades learning to see what was actually there rather than what he expected to see, and taken the parts with him without making any promises about timeline. When he brought them back 2 weeks later, what Reed saw when he unwrapped the cloth packaging made him stand still for a moment in the way that good work sometimes made him stand still. The leather was a different problem. The seat and the saddlebag faces and the grip wraps needed to be made to original specifications, which meant finding someone who worked with those specifications, which meant research and patience, and the kind of careful sourcing that Walt had apparently done as a matter of course over decades, and which Reed was learning from scratch. He found a craftsman in Taos through a chain of referrals that ran through Ed Garza, and then through a collector in Colorado Springs, and then through a woman in Denver who had been restoring pre-war Harleys since before Reed had been born. The pieces came back by freight, wrapped in brown paper, and when Reed installed them on the machine, the bike became, for the first time since he had found it under its dust cover, something complete. Not finished, complete. There was a difference. Finished implied a terminus. What the knucklehead was now was what it had been built to be, fully expressed, the way a sentence becomes itself only when the last word is in place. He had worked on it for 6 weeks in the hours that existed between everything else. Between the paying jobs that had grown from Hank Voss's word of mouth into a steady rotation of bikes through the bay, routine service, diagnostics, the occasional interesting fault that required the kind of thinking he had always found satisfying, because such problems leave no room for anything else. Between the ledger entries he had been making in the fifth notebook with increasing confidence, the language coming more naturally now, the block capitals he had absorbed from Walt's method appearing in his own handwriting without deliberate effort. Between the work he had begun doing with Casey Harwell. Casey had been at this shop for 6 weeks now. He came in at 7 and stayed until the work was done, and came in on Saturdays even though Reed had told him the shop was closed on Saturdays, because Casey had apparently decided that his own education operated on a different schedule than the shop's official hours, and that the difference was his problem to solve rather than Reed's obligation to accommodate. Reed had not discouraged this. He had simply made sure there was work available when Casey arrived. The kid learned the way Reed had hoped he would learn, not by being told, but by watching and doing and making mistakes and acknowledging the mistakes directly, and then not making them again. He asked precise questions, the questions of someone who had thought carefully about what he didn't know before deciding to ask about it. He had the mechanic's instinct that couldn't be taught because it wasn't a skill, but a disposition. The inclination to trust what the machine was telling you rather than what you expected it to say. 3 weeks after the courthouse, Reed had told Casey about the shop policy in fuller terms than he'd explained it initially. If someone comes in who needs something and can't pay, we do the work, Reed said. You know that. What I want you to understand is why. He leaned against the parts counter. Walt Decker ran this shop for 22 years, and he helped people who needed help, and he never told them he was doing it. He set things up so the help looked like coincidence. He did it that way because help that knows it's help changes how the person receiving it responds. They manage the relationship instead of doing the work. He watched Casey take this in. The policy isn't charity, it's investment. You're betting on a person the way Walt bet on people. You're saying, I think the situation is temporary and this person is sound. Most of the time you're right. Casey had been quiet for a moment. What about the times you're wrong? You lose what you put in, Reed said. That happens. It's not a reason to stop. Casey nodded with the slow deliberateness of someone who was going to think about this for a while before arriving at his own position on it, which was exactly the right response, and which Reed noted in the fifth ledger that evening in the same block capitals he had by now entirely made his own. The letter from Robert Mercer arrived on a Tuesday, not from Pueblo, from Colorado Springs, handwritten on plain paper, the envelope addressed in careful print to the owner, Hayes Moto, Thatcher Avenue, Pueblo, Colorado. Reed opened it at the service counter in the mid-morning quiet between jobs. Mr. Callahan, it began. My mother told me the building was open again. I've been thinking about how to write this for 3 weeks, and I've decided the most honest approach is the direct one. When I was 23 years old, I was in a situation I'm not going to describe in detail because the details don't matter now. What matters is that Walt Decker hired me when I had no business expecting anyone to hire me. He paid me fairly, and he expected a great deal, and he didn't make allowances for the circumstances I was coming out of. He just pointed at the work and said, get back to it, and that was exactly what I needed and couldn't have articulated that I needed. I've had my own shop in Colorado Springs for 12 years, 3 employees. One of them I hired 5 years ago in circumstances that reminded me of my own. A young man who had no reasonable expectation of being given a chance and who needed precisely the kind of opportunity I gave him. He manages the service floor now. I didn't understand until my mother explained the system, years after the fact, that I had been doing what Walt did without knowing I was doing it. That the thing he gave me had been passing forward through my own decisions in ways I wasn't tracking and hadn't attributed to anything except my own judgment. I'm writing because I want you to know that whatever you want to call what Walt built, it doesn't stop at the edges of those ledgers or the walls of that building. It moves, it gets inside people, and it changes how they make decisions. And those decisions change other people. And none of it is recorded anywhere or attributed to anyone. Walt never knew about the young man I hired. He was gone by then. But Walt is why that young man has a job today. I thought you should know that. Whatever you're building there, it's already larger than the building, Albert Mercer. Reed set the letter down. He read it again. He placed it beside the fifth ledger and sat at the counter for a long time, not thinking in the organized way he usually thought, but in the wider, less directed way that happens when information arrives that is too large for the usual processing. The system moved. It got inside people and changed how they made decisions, and those decisions changed other people, and none of it was recorded or attributed. Walt had helped Robert Mercer. Robert had hired a young man who now ran a service floor, who was in his daily work shaping the professional standards and habits of other people who would carry those standards into their own work and their own decisions. None of it traceable, none of it visible, all of it real. He picked up the pen and opened the fifth ledger. The system is not the building, he wrote. It is not the ledgers or the account or the list of names. The system is the decision. Every good decision made by someone Walt helped is part of the system. Every good decision made by someone those people helped is part of the system. It is not a local thing. It never was. He set the pen down and picked up his phone and called Iris Boland. She answered on the first ring. I got a letter from Robert Mercer, Reed said. I know, he called me before he sent it. She paused in the way she paused when she had more to say and was choosing the order. You want to know how far it goes? It wasn't a question. Yeah, Reed said. I've been tracking it where I can, Iris said. For 10 years since Walt died, quietly and without any particular system, because I'm a bookkeeper, not a researcher, but when I encountered evidence of it, I noted it. 12 second-generation cases. People helped by people Walt helped. 2 third-generation cases, though the connection in those is harder to trace, and I hold them with less certainty. A pause. Reed, she said, I've been doing this for 10 years while the building was closed. You've been open for less than 2 months. He let that sit in the silence for a moment. The second-generation cases, he said. Any of them in Pueblo? 3, she said. Send me what you have on them. The call that changed the shape of everything came on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the courthouse. Reed was in the service bay with both hands inside the Knucklehead's engine case, deep in the focused state that the work produced when the work required full attention, when his phone rang on the bench beside him. He considered letting it go to voicemail. He looked at the number, Colorado Springs area code, not a contact he recognized, and answered it. Is this Reed Callahan? A man's voice, older, carrying the quality of someone who has thought carefully about making this call and has decided to make it in spite of that thought rather than because of it. Yeah, my name is Owen Garrett. A pause. I don't expect that name to mean anything to you. It didn't. Go ahead, Reed said. I was Dennis Crane's senior partner, Owen said, before he left the firm 3 years ago. Reed's hands went still inside the engine. He withdrew them slowly and reached for the shop rag. I've been following the challenge to your property, Owen said. The bar complaint Frank Whitmore filed came across my desk as part of the Bar Association's preliminary review process. I'm on the ethics committee. He said this without ceremony, as establishing context rather than claiming importance. I have information relevant to the complaint that Frank Whitmore doesn't have. Information about the pattern of Crane's conduct during his time at our firm, specifically regarding property matters in Pueblo County. Reed said nothing. He waited. This is not a comfortable call for me to make. Owen Garrett's voice had the weight of a decision that had cost him something before he'd made it, and would cost him more after. Crane was my partner for 11 years. The legal profession has a complicated relationship with loyalty. But the bar complaint, combined with Judge Reyes's preservation order, indicates that what Crane has been doing has moved past a threshold I'm willing to be a silent observer of. He paused. I have documentation, he said. Internal firm records from the period of Crane's employment that show a pattern of conduct in Pueblo County property matters directly relevant to your situation and to the bar investigation. Communications between Crane and Southwest Capital Group that predate the original lien filing by 3 months. Reed was very still. The lien, Owen said, may not have been an independent financial instrument. It may have been created specifically to encumber this property at Crane's instigation as a means of establishing a legal obstacle to future transfer. How long have you known this? Reed said. He kept his voice level. He kept it level the way he had kept it level in rooms where the wrong response had permanent consequences. I reviewed the files after the bar complaint came in, Owen said. I am not going to tell you I would have found this otherwise. I might not have. Crane's personal client matters were not routinely visible to me through normal firm operations. Another pause. I'm telling you what I know when I know it. That is the best I can offer. Send the documentation to Frank Whitmore, Reed said. His contact information is on the public record. I already sent it this morning, Owen said. I'm calling you as a courtesy, so you know what's coming before it arrives rather than being surprised by it. He hung up. Reed sat on the service-based stool. Casey was at the other bench, and he'd heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand that something significant had shifted, and he had the instinct to keep his eyes on his own work and give Reed the space the moment required. Reed called Frank Whitmore. Frank had received the documentation 40 minutes before Reed called. He'd already read it. His voice when he answered carried a quality Reed hadn't heard in it before. Not excitement, because Frank Whitmore was not a man given to excitement, but the contained energy of a man looking at something that changes the shape of a problem he's been working on for weeks. If this documentation is authentic, Frank said, and I'm saying if because I need to verify provenance and chain of custody, but if it is, the lien was not an independent financial instrument. It was constructed. Crane had a relationship with Southwest Capital that predated the lien filing, and there are communications suggesting he directed the creation of the lien specifically to encumber this property against future transfer. Which means, Reed said, which means the entire basis of the challenge was manufactured, Frank said. A manufactured lien cannot support a title challenge. The case doesn't fail on procedural grounds. It fails on the merits of the central instrument, because the instrument itself was never legitimate. He paused with the weight of a man who has spent his career believing in the integrity of the system he worked within and is experiencing the feeling of seeing that belief confirmed by something that simultaneously required the system to have been violated. It also means the bar complaint becomes significantly more serious. Suborning the creation of a fraudulent financial instrument to support litigation is not a technical violation of professional ethics. It is the kind of thing that ends careers. How long to get in front of Judge Reyes with this? Reed said. I can file a motion to dismiss within 48 hours, Frank said. The documentation from Owen Garrett is self-authenticating. These are original firm records with the firm's metadata intact. Crane can challenge admissibility, but the challenge will be thin. The stronger argument is the substance. He paused. Reed, I think it's over. Not immediately, but these things take time to process through the court formally. But I think it's over. Reed thanked him and hung up. He told Casey to hold down the bay for an hour. He got on his bike and he rode. Not anywhere specific. He rode until the motion organized what stillness couldn't. The road and the cold air letting the pieces settle into their proper relationship to each other. Walt Decker had not left him defenseless. He had left him a system. And the system, it turned out, included a retired records clerk who knew every archive in the county recorder's office, and a property attorney who had made a promise and kept it, and 9 people who had driven from Denver and shown up on courthouse steps, and a former law partner who had looked at a bar complaint and decided that his obligation to the truth outweighed his loyalty to the man who had betrayed it. He rode for 30 minutes. Then he turned back toward Pueblo. He had work to do. That was always the answer. It had been the answer the morning he'd found the building, and it was the answer now. The formal dismissal of Crane's challenge came 43 days after the initial hearing. Judge Patricia Reyes ruled from the bench in a proceeding that lasted 11 minutes. Crane was not present. A different attorney appeared in his place, a careful, quiet man who offered no argument and left the courthouse immediately after the ruling with the expression of someone who had accepted an unpleasant assignment and was glad to have it completed. The lien was ruled fatally defective. Not on the procedural grounds Frank had originally argued, but on the more fundamental basis that credible evidence existed, suggesting the instrument had been manufactured to cloud title rather than representing a legitimate financial obligation. A manufactured instrument could not support a title challenge. Without the instrument, the challenge had no foundation. Judge Reyes noted for the record that the bar complaint against Crane was proceeding through the appropriate channels and that the court had no further jurisdiction over that matter. 11 minutes. Reed received the news by phone, standing at the service counter while Casey was in the bay working on a valve adjustment, and Vera Holston sat in one of the two chairs Reed had placed near the front window for customers who preferred to wait rather than leave their bikes. Vera was 81 years old and had been riding a Sportster since she was 65 and had walked into the shop 3 weeks earlier, looked around the front room with the expression of someone making a comparison between what they remembered and what they saw, and said without preamble that the smell was right. Reed had looked at her. "It smells like Walt's shop," she said. "Oil and work and coffee." She had looked at him with the direct assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to dispense with social softening entirely. "You're keeping it right." He had thought about the knucklehead and what Walt's father had said when he brought it to his son. Keep this right. He had thought that maybe right wasn't only a mechanical condition. Maybe it was a quality that spaces could hold, something that lived in the patterns of use and care and intention rather than in the physical structure itself, something that accumulated over time and persisted even through the years when no one was present to add to it. He hung up the phone and stood at the counter. "Good news," Vera said from her chair. She had the serenity of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information and is not surprised that it has arrived. "The lawsuit is finished," Reed said. She nodded with the unhurried certainty of someone for whom the outcome had been a matter of when rather than whether. "I figured it would be." She adjusted the magazine in her lap. "Walt didn't build things that fell apart easy." Reed looked at her. "You knew him well." "Well enough." She didn't look up from the magazine immediately. "He fixed my bike for 20 years. Every time I came in, we talked. He asked questions and he listened to the answers, which is rarer than most people understand." She set the magazine down. "He told me something once, near the end, when I think he already knew he was sick, though he didn't say so directly." She looked up. "He said most people try to make their mark by being visible. He said the older he got, the more he believed the real work was invisible. That invisible things lasted because they didn't give anyone a target to aim at." She picked the magazine back up. "He was right," she said. "He usually was." The knucklehead was ready on a Saturday morning in December. Reed had known it was ready the evening before, when he'd made the final adjustments and stood back and looked at the machine in the bay light, and understood that what he was seeing had become what it was supposed to be. Not because he had imposed anything on it. The restoration had not been about his judgment of what the bike should look like, but about his understanding of what it had been. He had worked from the evidence of original construction, from Edgar's knowledge of period materials, from the specifications the craftsmen in Taos had worked from. The result was not his. It was the machine's, returned to itself after years of waiting. Saturday morning, Casey arrived at 7, even though the shop was officially closed, because Casey had established a pattern of Saturday appearances that Reed had stopped commenting on. He was at the workbench working through a manual Reed had given him on pre-war Harley architecture when Reed came out of the back with the knucklehead. He rolled it to the center of the front room and stood beside it. Casey looked up. He looked at the bike for a long moment with the focused attention of someone who understood enough about the difficulty of what he was seeing to recognize its significance. "That's real," Casey said. "Yeah? You going to sell it?" Reed looked at the machine. He thought about Walt's father bringing it to his son and saying, "Keep this right." He thought about Walt keeping it right for 30 years without ever putting a leg over it. He thought about what Lou Briggs had said. Walt used to say that bike wasn't going anywhere until it had somewhere worth going to. "No," Reed said. Casey nodded. He didn't ask the next question, which was then what, because he was learning that some answers arrived in their own time, and the value of a thing was not always located in its use. Iris Boland called at 10 that morning. "I want to tell you something about Walt," she said. No preamble. She had called enough times now that the absence of preamble felt natural. The efficiency of a woman who had spent 50 years in professional life learning that the most respectful thing you could offer another person's time was the direct use of it. "He was sick when he closed the building," she said. He didn't tell many people. I knew because I handled his finances and the medical expenses told the story clearly enough if you knew how to read them. She paused. He closed the building because he couldn't maintain it anymore, and he didn't want to watch it decline. He chose to seal it rather than let it deteriorate. The preservation of the building, keeping it sealed, keeping the power on, keeping the machines in the condition they were in, that was the last act of care he could perform for the place. Reed was standing in the front room. He could see the knucklehead through the service bay doorway. He died 2 years after he closed, she said, in a hospital room in Colorado Springs. No family. His estate was minimal. He had spent most of what he accumulated on the system and on keeping the building viable. She paused in a way that was different from her other pauses, something held in it that her professional composure was containing rather than eliminating. The last time I saw him, a few weeks before the end, he told me he wasn't worried. He said the right person would find the building. He said the building knew what it was for and that what it was for would call the right person in. She stopped. I always thought that was a little too poetic for a man as practical as Walt, she said. Reed said nothing. And now, Ira said, you're there. He thanked her. He stood in the front room for a long moment after he'd put the phone in his pocket. He thought about Walt Decker dying in a hospital room believing that the right person would come. He thought about the 9 years between Walsenburg and Pueblo and what those years had looked like from the outside. The drift and the erosion and the 3-year passage through a territory with no name, the 9x12 room, the $137. From the inside, those years had felt like loss. From the outside, evidently, they had looked like preparation. He went and got his jacket and his helmet. Casey looked up. Lock up when you're done, Reed said. Casey looked at the knucklehead, at Reed's helmet, at the front door. Yeah, he said. Go ahead. Reed rolled the knucklehead through the front entry and out onto the lot at Thatcher Avenue into the December air. Sharp and dry, the mountains visible to the west in the clarity that follows a cold front, the kind of clarity that makes distances seem shorter than they are while simultaneously making the things at those distances seem more fully themselves. He checked the fuel. He checked the controls. He did the walk around the way he always did, hands on the machine, reading it one more time before trusting it with his life. Because that was what riding was. An act of trust that began with knowledge and ended with something beyond knowledge. You did what you could do and then you committed. He put his leg over, sat in the stillness that exists in the moment before an engine starts, the pause that knows what comes next and is holding itself in the space before it. He thought about 11 years of sealed silence. He thought about a rubber-banded key and 4 numbers hidden in the back of a receipt book, and a cassette tape labeled for whoever comes next, and a letter with 1 word on the envelope, and a steel box, and 5 ledgers, and a trust account, and 9 people on courthouse steps, and a bar complaint, and a dismissed lawsuit, and a 5th notebook filling page by page with new names and new observations, and new decisions made quietly and without attribution in the way that Walt had made decisions, and that Reed was learning to make them. He thought about a highway outside Walsenburg, and a broken engine, and 15 minutes, and a phrase he'd said without thinking because it was simply true. This isn't that kind of thing. He thought about Walt Decker dying in a hospital room in Colorado Springs, believing that the building knew what it was for, and that what it was for would call the right person in. He kicked the engine. The knucklehead caught on the first kick. It ran the way an engine runs when it has been built right and kept right across generations, and restored right by hands that understood the difference between imposing a result and recovering one. Not with drama, not with noise in the way that modern machines announce themselves. With the deep, settled authority of a thing that knows its own purpose and meets it without apology. The sound of 50 years of American engineering expressing itself through a machine that should have been a relic and was instead, this morning, on this lot, in this December light, entirely and completely alive. Reed sat on it and felt it run. He thought about what Walt had said on the tape. Somewhere worth going to. He pulled out onto Thatcher Avenue. He rode north through Pueblo, through the working streets and the quiet neighborhoods and the intersections that held the ordinary life of a city that didn't ask many questions and didn't offer many answers, and which suited. Reed had come to understand the work he was doing here. Invisible work. Work that operated below the surface of ordinary life the way a foundation operates below the surface of a building, present everywhere, visible nowhere, doing its essential work in the dark. He rode past the courthouse where 9 people had stood on the steps in the October air, past the hardware store where he had spent $41 on a cordless driver and a set of bits and felt the weight of a man spending what he had left on something he didn't yet know was necessary. Past the poles on Thatcher Avenue, where the county auction signs had been taped and had long since come down, the small paper documents that had changed everything because he had been walking past at the right moment and had followed them out of habit more than intention. He rode out of the city, the road climbed west toward the mountains, and the sky opened up and the Rockies came into full view. The permanent presence of high country that makes everything happening at its feet feel appropriately small without making it feel unimportant. He rode until the city was behind him and the road was empty and the cold air carried the smell of high elevation and distance. He pulled over on a stretch of highway where the shoulder was wide and the view ran unobstructed to the mountains, shut the engine down, sat in the sudden silence. He thought about K.C. Harwell at the bench on a Saturday morning, teaching himself from a manual Reed had given him, building the foundation of something that would eventually be his own. He thought about the fifth ledger on the counter back at the shop, and the pages he had been filling, and the pages still blank and waiting. He thought about Robert Mercer's letter and the young man managing a service floor in Colorado Springs, who had no idea that his job traced back to a decision made in a motorcycle shop in Pueblo by a man he would never meet. He thought about Iris's 12 second-generation cases and 2 third-generation cases and what those numbers implied about the shape of the thing Walt had built and what it implied about the shape of the thing Reed was continuing. He thought about what it meant to continue something, not to own it, not to inherit it, to continue it, to take up a thread where someone else had set it down and keep it moving in the same direction with the same intention. Not because you were told to, because you understood what it was, and understanding what it was made the continuation feel less like a choice and more like a recognition. The recognition of a person who has been looking for the right work and has found it, and in finding it understands that the looking and the finding were not separate events. He had been a Hell's Angel for 11 years. He had built his identity around that membership the way men build identities around the things that give them structure and purpose and a clear account of who they are in relation to other people. And then the membership had ended and the identity had collapsed, and he had spent 3 years in the territory with no name, waiting for the days to accumulate into something that eventually made sense. He understood now that those years had not been wasted. They had been necessary. A man had to be stripped of the things covering him before you could see what was underneath. Walt Decker had watched the stripping from a distance and had drawn a conclusion from it that Reed himself had never been able to draw. And the conclusion was this: what was underneath was the right material. What was underneath was what the building needed. He had not been chosen because he was exceptional. He had been chosen because he was sound. He sat on the knucklehead for a long time in the December silence with the mountains in front of him. Then he kicked the engine and turned back toward Pueblo. He rode back through the city, back through the working streets and the quiet neighborhoods, back to Thatcher Avenue, back to the building with the Harley-Davidson sign that had lost half its letters 12 years ago and still stood and would stand a while longer. He pulled into the front lot and shut the engine down and sat for a moment in the silence after. The building was locked. Casey had gone, but the light inside was on, the light from the fluorescents in the service bay coming through the gap under the back door, the light of a working space that had not gone dark. Reed had not turned it off when he'd left this morning. He had not turned it off since the first day he tripped the main breaker and the 4 remaining bulbs had come to life in the sealed bay. He did not turn lights off in the shop. It had become, without deliberate decision, a practice. The way certain things become practices when they are expressions of something you believe, rather than things you have decided to do. He took off his helmet and held it in his hands. He looked at the building, at the sign with the missing letters, at the glass in the front windows, clean now, without the boards that had covered it for 12 years. At the things visible through it, the service counter, the display cases, the photograph of Walt Decker he had placed on the wall behind the counter 3 weeks ago. Not as a memorial, as a reminder. A daily instruction about the quality of attention the work required and the quality of invisibility that made the work last. He thought about what Vera Holston had said. Walt didn't build things that fell apart easy. He thought about what Walt had recorded on the tape. Keep it right, Walt. He put the key in his jacket pocket and stood on the lot for a moment in the December air, with the mountains behind him and the city around him and the building in front of him. The building that had cost him $19 in 3 months of his life, and everything he thought he understood about what his life was for. He went inside, he went to the service bay, he picked up the fifth ledger and the pen from the counter drawer, and he sat on the bench stool and opened to the page where he'd last written. He wrote Casey Harwell's name at the top of a fresh page. Below it, in the same block capitals he had absorbed from the notebooks that had been waiting in the steel box for the right hands to open them, he wrote the first full entry. Not a note, not an observation, but the beginning of a case file. The kind that documented a situation and a person and a calculation made with incomplete information and carried forward on the basis of a pattern rather than a story. Casey came in looking for work in November, he wrote. No certification, no formal training, but he'd been taking apart engines since he was 12 because he needed to understand how they worked, and no one was going to teach him. I tested him 3 ways. He found 2 of 3 faults without being told what to look for. He makes mistakes and acknowledges them directly. He comes in on Saturdays because he's decided his education operates on a different schedule than the shop's official hours. I don't know yet what he'll become. I know the material is sound. That's enough to work with. Reed set the pen down. He looked at the entry for a moment. He thought about Walt writing the first entry in the first ledger 11 years ago, not knowing what it would become or how far it would travel or whose hands would eventually hold the notebook and read what he had recorded. Making the decision because it was the right decision and because the person in front of him needed it and because those 2 conditions together were always enough of a reason. Reed closed the 5th ledger. He set it on the counter where it belonged, beside the receipt book in the steel box and the photograph of the man who had built this place and sealed it and left it waiting and died believing that the waiting would eventually end. He stood in the service bay in the light of the 4 remaining fluorescent bulbs, the light he did not turn off, the light that showed through the gap under the back door and told anyone who cared to notice that something in this building was still working, still present, still doing what it had been built to do. He had not been running for 3 months. He had not been drifting. He was the man who kept the light on. In Pueblo, Colorado, on a December morning, with the knucklehead cooling on the front lot, and the 5th ledger filling up inside, and 11 names becoming 22, becoming however many came next. That was exactly, precisely, and completely enough.